Hi everyone, my name is Pooja Mistry and I am a developer advocate at Postman. And today I'm going to be sharing a talk about APIOps and what you can build in an API first world. So I'm so glad that you all are here with me today. This is such an interesting time to be talking about APIs. You might be wondering why you're here today. So uh, as I mentioned, I'm a dev advocate for Postman, and Postman is used by 25 million people worldwide. So it is an API development environment. And for many people, it's a tool that is ubiquitous and helps with API testing, API development, and all parts of the API lifecycles for developers. And you might be wondering why you are here today listening to this talk. And the reason why is because APIs are running the world. And over the last 12 months, there's a global growth of the API ecosystem. And there are numbers of practitioners that are and countries that are being represented and APIs being sent worldwide. Uh, for example, we have over 234 countries all over the world sending 1.13 billion API requests. And we have over 25 million API and Postman users alone. So as you can see, it's a global ecosystem, and that APIs are widely shared and widely utilized throughout. And with APIs, powering everything around us behind our desktops, behind our web and mobile applications. They're connecting everyday appliances for us, from cars to IoT devices to the internet. And so with that, we're definitely moving towards a API first world. And so when we use these objects, we often focus on the interface that we use to control them. But beneath the surface of a lot of these applications, APIs they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting and they're performing a lot of meaningful actions. And this kind of gives us a little bit more insight into all the different applications that are being created and the wide variety of data that is being consumed and utilized on a day-to-day basis. So with that said, I wanted to kind of dive into who are maybe the users of these APIs and what are the processes and that can be used. So the way that I like to kind of think about API ops is being used in multiple different ways, and it's used to work with testing and building lean, modular, scalable applications. And we're going to be diving a little bit into what that looks like as we work with some of our APIs through this in this talk. So before we kind of go into that, let's kind of talk a little bit about the two main players of APIs, which are the producers, the creators of APIs, and of course, the consumers. So the producers and consumers can be kind of broken up into two main personas, which I like to see that can be broken up into a whole API lifecycle. So their roles are really defined by how they work together, and the way that they can work together is through a well-defined API lifecycle, which is taking advantage of a whole API platform. So on the consumer side, we have people that are discovering APIs, evaluating them, integrating them into their various different applications, testing their APIs, and eventually observing them. Whereas on the producer side, we have the creators of the APIs, the ones that are designing and defining their API specifications, and then they're eventually developing it, securing them, and deploying them out into the market for consumers to then discover them. And with Postman, you can see both the producer and the consumer work hand in hand in one single platform. And For those of you who might have used Postman to do some testing, you're, either working with an API on a consumer end, or for those of you who've worked with Postman to do some development, you're most likely using the producer lifecycle to create and test your APIs there. So you'll take a little bit of deeper look into what that looks like. And for those of you who are not familiar with Postman, you'll see it as a pretty big end-to-end platform. So before we dive in, I like to kind of take this whole concept of building applications and working with APIs in the analogy of working with some sort of recipe. So since I love to cook and bake, it was very much a no-brainer when it came to deciding a nice analogy that would let me go down this path. So when I think about most successful applications, I think of them in the form of recipes. So if we break down this recipe that we have here, we see two components, one component being the ingredients, of course, and the other component being the directions which allow you to build a unique and consumable product. So with your ingredients, I like to take a closer look at them. I like to take a look at them in the form of APIs themselves. So you have multiple APIs that you can combine together, given some interesting direction, which is like some sort of workflow or some sort of application design. You can build a very interesting consumable product for your users throughout. So when we have some unique ingredients, we can create some unique consumable products. And this is something that, maybe I'd like for you all to think. So let's take a look at some ingredients that we might have here. So we have a variety of different ingredients, so for example, if we look at these APIs, we have WebEx with Gmail and Slack. What kind of product can that make, or what kind of integration application could that make? In the case of working with Spotify and Sheets and Twilio, that itself makes a completely unique product. So today we're going to be taking a look at an application built with these specific ingredients, and we're going to be taking a deeper look into the applications that can be built through the various combinations of APIs that we have. So before we get started in building our dish or our unique consumable product, we always have to take a look at our tools. So with Postman being a end-to-end API platform, it's a great place to kind of get started. So for those of you who might be familiar with Postman, it is an API platform for building and using APIs, and it simplifies each step of that API lifecycle that we talked about earlier with the producers and the consumers. And it streamlines the collaboration and allows you to build APIs faster, as well as test them in a variety of different ways. So I'm going to be showing you the various different ways that you can go about testing your APIs, building your workflows through working with Postman. So for those of you who have been familiar, that you might know it as a place to send requests and receive some information behind your APIs. But I'd like to let you know that there's so much more to Postman, especially in 2023 with a lot of updates and a lot of great collaboration tools. It's becoming a place where you can work with your documentation, work in Workspace, work collaboratively, work with automation through our Postman CLI, through Newman. And it's becoming a whole end-to-end platform when it comes to all the various things that you might be interested in when it comes to working in your API lifecycles. So the starting point for a lot of for a lot of developers or users is a Postman workspace. And so I like to think about a workspace as a workbench. So for many skilled professionals, they have their workbench and they want to set it up the way that they'd like to work. And so for developers, Postman provides a personal workspace for free. And these workspaces allow any developers to work with quality managers, product managers, and to organize their work and their API work and do the things that they want to do. So you can create workspaces in different ways. You can create your own personal workspace. You can create a team workspace, which allows you to work with your team members. You can work a partner workspace where if you're working and collaborating with some partners and their APIs. And then you can, of course, create a public workspace, which I like to think of as almost like a public GitHub repo to show off your work. And you can, you can have people that can watch and fork your workspace and your collections there. So that's kind of the starting point for working out with Postman. And then, of course, we have our collections. So our collections are a very important part of our workspace because they allow you to organize your API requests. So the collection format is an open source JSON format, and it allows you to organize requests, whether those are your REST API request or your gRPC, GraphQL, or your WebSocket requests. And they allow you to work with them seamlessly across your API lifecycle. So the interesting thing about collections is that since they are JSON format, they provide a machine and human readable representation of our APIs, and they can be shared and executed. And you can work with different parameters similar to various different definitions, such as open API formats that allow you to kind of create entire workflows in your lifecycle. So collections are highly interoperable, where you can convert collections to an open API definition or vice versa. And so you can work with them on the collection level, or you can work with them on the API level, where you can create an API using an API definition and then generate collections from that to test your API for different purposes, for including mocking and documentation and things like that. So for those of you who might not be familiar with collections, this is a wonderful starting point. So once we have our collection, we have the heart of our working with our API, which is working with a request. And the interesting thing about working with requests in Postman is that there are so many multiple protocols. Many people may be familiar with working with REST APIs, and I have an example of a REST API here. But you can send these requests within a Postman. You can set up your query parameters. You can set up authorization. And a lot of times where you can set up a lot of dynamic variables here as well to work seamlessly with your APIs. And we have the different building blocks that you can use, whether those are HTTP requests, GraphQL requests, gRPC requests, WebSocket requests. So this is a place where you're able to kind of work hand in hand with your API as well. So, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about variables, because variables enable you to store and reuse values within Postman. And this allows you to work a lot more dynamically. And we'll take a look at what that looks like within a example that I have to show. And by storing variables, you can reference them throughout your collection. So you can reference them through an environment variable. You can reference them to a collection variable where they're more suitable for specific collections. And then you can reference them globally, which can be used throughout your entire Postman workspace. So if you have a workspace with multiple collections and you're using similar variables, you can see them being interoperable throughout. So That's one interesting aspect about variables, which allow that directionality of your applications that we talked a little bit earlier. And then, of course, to create that workflow and that dynamic uh, way of working, the aspects of Postman, such as the pre-request scripts as well as the test request scripts, allow you to build a more dynamic behavior to your Postman application. So Postman has a very powerful Node.js runtime, and it allows you to build requests that contain dynamic parameters and pass data between requests. So you can build completely end-to-end scalable applications with using Postman APIs and requests. And you can add JavaScript code to execute during various events. So now that we have the various building blocks and the tools of our the tools that we're going to be using, let's take a deeper look into a workflow that we can build. And before we do that, I wanted to just dive into the API builder as well, because the API builder is also, it's not only, so we talked about the collections format as the way for consumers to consume APIs and build workflows. API builder is for a producer of APIs, so allows you to build an API through API definitions such as OpenAPI, GraphQL, and you can go ahead and define your entire API here and then generate collections to use. So let's talk a little bit about today what we're going to be building. So I have a recipe, which is an application that I've worked with multiple different APIs to build. So today we're going to be building a workflow that uses Twitter's APIs to then set the location of all of my teammates on my team on a global level. So I use multiple different APIs here, position stack API, weather API, because I wanted to know weather of my colleagues as well. And so in this workflow, you'll see how we use variables, we use multiple APIs, we use scripts, and we use many things to build an end-to-end application. So essentially, this is an application that we're going to be working with. We'll talk a little bit about the API workflows that we have available here. And so let's dive a little bit deeper. If you are interested in working with the specific application, you can, of course, fork this collection. And this collection will take you to this public Postman templates workspace. And this is a great workspace because there are so many different applications in this workspace, doing multiple different things, working with so many different APIs. And these are all created by Postmanauts, and they're to share. So since this is a public workspace, you're able to take a look at this workspace and you can go ahead and create a fork and fork it into any of your workspaces that you might have available, that you might be interested in working in. So like a test workspace, and it's kind of very similar to forking a repository to work with. So I have a example of this workspace, so visualizing Postmanauts across the globe. So this, like I mentioned, this whole collection is all about working with multiple APIs using various different workflows. So with Postman, you can work with multiple different workflows. So I'd like to share a blog about workflows that we have available. So with Postman, I wanted to talk about, we're interacting with multiple APIs, chaining different requests, building sequences, sending asynchronous requests, and then of course looping over requests. So these are the three main workflows that we're going to be talking about and that use scripting. So let's take a deeper look into what that looks like. And I have a blog here available as well. So for those of you who are interested and want to read the blog of this particular application, you can take a look here as well. And I'm happy to share that out. So once you have forked your collection into your own workspace. So here I have a workspace that I have available. You can take a deeper look into your collection here. So here, like I mentioned, we have collections and we are working with various different I'm organizing these by various different folders. So for example, there's multiple ways to build this application. So this application can be built using individual Postman requests. It can be built using asynchronous requests, which allow you to send multiple requests as well. And then, of course, it allows you to work by looping over requests. So I'm going to show you the different ways that you're able to build out this. When you're working individually, we have our request here, and we have the various different parameters that are available. I also have various variables that I'm using. So I'm using a environments variable called Postmanauts, which takes every variable as various different objects. So all of my colleagues are objects, as well as different users that I have available. And then you can also set variables on the variable level on your collection. So this is where I store things like my authorization tokens that you can see I have inherited from a parent folder. So I can use authorization tokens for my bearer tokens and things like that for my API keys. You can also see the various different documentation that is available here as well. So in this case, I wanted to show you that you can build out a whole unique application by sending requests individually. So here when I send this Twitter API request, I can get some data back, like my username and my location that I have set on Twitter. And I have that set into a environment object within my environments variable here. So when I set that as a object, I can I can get the data back, such as my name, my location, and things like that. So I'm also including tests within this request, a test which includes that a status is 200. So I want to make sure that that test works. And I wanted to include tests that include the data that I'm interested in, such as the location and things like that. So it allows you to work a little bit more dynamically. So in this case, I have you can see that this data is null because I'm using another API here that takes that object that I have, and it uses that location variable, which is a part of my object that I have here, and it can then take that location and then get my longitude latitude data from a position stack API to then further fill out that information and use that much more dynamically. So here I also have multiple tests as well. So if I do that for all of my colleagues, I can eventually create an application which lets me visualize that data. So I can create an application for each of my colleagues' objects, and I can create a custom JSON using the Postman Echo to post a custom JSON. And I can get all of my colleagues' data and visualize that globally as well. So here I'm able to use some interesting front end JavaScript and a D3JS library to do a lot of visualization. So here you can see that it's multiple, there's multiple ways to do this. You can do this individually at an individual level, or you can also work with multiple requests here as well. So in this case, I can send requests asynchronously. So I can send multiple APIs. So I can, get data through an array, send multiple APIs asynchronously, and then also visualize accordingly as well. So that's another interesting way to kind of work with this API. And then finally, when you're working in a looping way, you can chain these requests through using a method called Postman set next request. So here I have this example of here where I'm setting a next request. So when I loop through these requests, based on the user that I'm working with, it will send that API once that API data is received. So in this case, I'm working with a collection runner. So collection runners let you automate your APIs in a way where you can send multiple APIs. You can run these manually, or you can schedule these runs on a monitor, which lets you run them periodically. You can automate these APIs using a CLI, which allows you to run through a automated system. And you can connect this API through various different CI/CD pipelines, such as we have Bitbucket, GitLab, Jenkins. So this allows you to further automate your API. And then this eventually, when I run this request manually, I can set the iteration. So once I run this API, you can see that I'm getting the longitude and latitude for all of my Twitter users. And then once I will loop through that API until there's no more users found, and then I will loop through the weather API to get the weather for each location, finally filling out all the data and then being able to then visualize my colleagues' SO. So those are the different ways that you can work with various different workflows. So like I mentioned, here we have the ingredients, which are the APIs. In this case, I've used Twitter, I've used Position Stack, I've used Weather API, and then the directions, which is either working with workflows, individual requests, building out scripts to build out a dynamic application. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into that. So I like to think of this as ingredients being put together. So we have one API request, we're getting the response through those scripts, we're connecting that to another API, scripting that to get another response, and eventually we have a consumable product and an application that is being able to be used by your users. So when we talk about, this is creating one dish, right? So one application. But when we talk about scaling that recipe, we are talking about the concept of APIOps in a way. So APIOps allows you to reuse and scale out your modular design workflows. And so in this scenario, we are talking about interacting with multiple APIs, chaining API calls, triggering conditional workflows, and making an end-to-end API reusable. So APIOps takes those concepts and applies the concepts of GitOps and DevOps to build out API deployment. So by using this practice from these two different methodologies, APIOps enables everyone to be involved in that, everyone that's working with these APIs lifecycle to be involved in that, in the whole development to deployment process. So if you think about this in a more end-to-end lifecycle way, you have producers building out your APIs, deploying your APIs, and then you're working to scale out those APIs to build those conditional workflows to build a consumable product. So with APIOps, it involves a lot of, the heart of working with APIOps involves, end-to-end traceability and continuous feedback. So you have that entire feedback loop of deployment, operating, monitoring, and APIOps is used for developers, DevOps, testers, so they can work very collaboratively when it comes to producers creating APIs to the consumers consuming the APIs as well. So it is the art of mixing APIs and building out a scalable API product as well. So with the heart of API ops is automation. So we talked a little bit of automation when I showed you an example of what it looks like to automate your APIs, but there are different ways to automate, especially with Postman. I showed you the collection runner where you're able to automate manually by sending your request through iteration. You can automate using the Postman CLI, which allows you to connect to various CI/CD providers. And then you can, of course, use Newman, which is a open source way of the Postman CLI, which allows you to also build custom open source reports, things like that. And then with our CI/CD automation, we have, you're able to connect to multiple environments and generate CI configurations. And then, of course, you can automate through scheduled runs, which let you automate in a way where you're able to trigger alerts on failures and successes. And you can see a whole array of your API application being run at multiple different times of the day that are scheduled. So this allows you to kind of get a little bit of more of a wholesome view of how your API workflow is running throughout. So ultimately, the being able to automate in multiple different ways helps you scale out your workflows and allows you to reuse your workflows and build out that whole end-to-end lifecycle. And then another interesting way to automate, which this feature recently GA'd, is Postman Flows. So Postman Flows is a wonderful low-code, no-code application where you're able to connect multiple APIs and create the logic and also create dashboards to create a visual output of your application in an interesting way. So Flows is a relatively new feature, and it allows you to build out that scalable application and scale beyond just a single workflow. So this is a really interesting feature that is definitely worth checking out, especially if you're working with multiple APIs and are interested in building out readable dashboards and interesting output. So there we go. So that's Flows. And so with that, I'd like to kind of take that back and ask you the same question that I asked earlier in this talk: is what will you build? So now that you have a little bit of an understanding of how to work with APIs and combine them and build workflows and work in a way where you're building single workflows, but then you can scale the workflows, what are the applications that you can build? And the applications here are absolutely limitless when it comes to working with APIs. So, you can take this time to kind of think about what it is that you might be interested in building. And if you need some inspiration, we have our Postman API public network, which is a place where you can discover all the various APIs that Postman has to offer from companies worldwide. So this is a place to discover the various APIs that are available. In this case, you can explore all the popular APIs. You can explore APIs by categories. You can explore all different APIs here, and you can see the different APIs that are available through the Postman public network. For example, here I'm looking at the Slack APIs, and you can see the various different views that these APIs have had, and you can work with their APIs directly by forking them into your own repository. So I hope this gives you a deeper understanding of working with public APIs, collections, and gives you a lot more interesting ideas. And I'm excited to see what everyone has, how your wheels are churning when it comes to working with multiple APIs. And I hope this was such an insightful session for you all. So I'm so happy to be sharing this with you all. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram if you have any questions when it comes to building out API workflows. Thank you.